Hi everyone, welcome to the September 20th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at last weekend's racing from all over North America as we're going to head north of the border to start the show to talk about some of the Grade 1 action from Woodbine last week, topped by that Grade 1 Woodbine Mile, won so impressively by Modern Games. We'll also discuss the two-year-old race this summer in Natalma that they ran there on the undercard last Saturday. Then we'll move down back into the U.S. to talk about some turf racing from Belmont at the Big A. They finished up their turf triple series running the Jockey Club Derby and Jockey Club Oaks, as well as another stakes on Sunday. We'll recap all of those. Then move on to Churchill Downs, where obviously they were just running dirt races this past week, but they ran some stakes that achieved decent speed figures for the older horses. Also some two-year-old events that produced some pretty sizable payouts, some big upsets in the Iroquois and Pocahontas. So we'll talk about those along with some maiden race and allowance races that achieved some nice speed figures for the two-year-olds in Kentucky last week. Then we'll finish things up with a two-year-old stakes race from Monmouth Park that probably serves as a prep for a Breeders' Cup event. And Craig, speaking of the Breeders' Cup, it does feel like we're starting to get these prep races rolling in. And this past week, it felt like we got a little bit of clarity for some of the turf races that will be contested on Breeders' Cup weekend, particularly due to the invasion of some Charlie Appleby runners to North America.
Yeah, those were some performances by his runners. I didn't total up the lengths for his three wins, but it sure looked like a bunch, probably 15 at least. And all three you don't usually see those kind of routes in turf races where horses are just running away from the field. So to see it three times from one guy, it was impressive, that's for sure.
Yeah, and let's kick off with the horse that I think most people would regard as his most impressive winter of the weekend. That would be Modern Games in the Grade 1 Woodbine Mile. And Greg, I've got to think this horse has kind of established himself as the early favorite for the Breeders' Cup Mile, assuming that they come back for that race. I mean, as you said, he was just so dominant in victory. Winning a Grade 1 turf race by over 5 lengths is not something you see that often. And it's not like he was beating up on a bunch of slouches. I mean, Ivar ran his race to get up into second, just was nowhere near the winner at the wire.
No, I do think Ivar had a little bit of trouble that maybe would have made the margin closer, but certainly still would have been an open lengths win by Modern Games. He's getting a 127 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, so it's about as good as we've seen this year in a Grade 1 turf race. It is a Grade 1 type figure and certainly that type of performance.
Yeah, we've kind of been talking all year about it, how this older turf division in the U.S. is pretty wide open. Nobody's really establishing themselves as the clear leader. Horses like Santine and Casa Creed both have a couple of Grade 1 victories on their resumes, but you have to think that Modern Games, if he produces another performance like this in the Breeders' Cup, is going to be pretty tough for the Americans to handle. We'll see what other Europeans decide to come over for that race. I did want to get your take on the ride that William Buick gave Modern Games, Craig, because you mentioned a little bit the trouble that Modern Games had in the stretch. Cheryl Spite, another one that just kind of got basically stymied in traffic behind Modern Games as that one was making his move. I saw some people kind of comparing the William Buick ride to what we sometimes see from Irad Ortiz, just kind of bullying his way through to get there on the best horse. Modern Games was going to win this race regardless, but I guess I was wondering if you thought that some of those pushy tactics in upper stretch were really necessary.
I guess I would have to watch again. I was more watching on the turn because it looked like he might be bottled up for a while. But to my eye, it looked like he got pretty clear on his own. Maybe I'd have to see it again. I think he was just so dominant, I didn't pay a lot of attention. It did look like in the stretch he wasn't running particularly straight. I was wondering about that myself. But it's one I'll definitely have to view again. I don't have a strong opinion just from watching it the one time.
Yeah, I would say that he was walking a fine line there. Cheryl Spite, the horse that I think got in the most trouble, who just got basically cut off by Modern Games at the top of the stretch and really had to steady in traffic. He just wasn't moving as fast as Modern Games when he made that move. And I mean, he showed such a turn of foot, the winner did, that nobody could really stay with him, and any trouble that they were getting him was basically alleviated after a few strides because Modern Game's just going right by every horse in the race. So I didn't have a huge problem with it. I thought Cheryl Spite might have been able to achieve a slightly better position if not for that trouble, but at the end of the day, nobody was in the same league as the winner, and I think we should remember that he is just a 3-year-old who was beating up on the older horses here, so arguably this runner still has room to improve. He's obviously come such a long way since he won that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf last year, and scary to think this one could continue developing through the end of the year.
It is scary, and it's also, it just kind of shows you something we all know already. The Europeans are just better on turf, and there have been times where an individual horse or two is able to run with them, but it's hard for me to see that this year with the fields we've seen and the speed figures I've been given out. So it's going to be tough. It'll be interesting to see what Europeans ship over because Modern Games, while a Group 1 winner, I don't know if he's even considered a top 3 miler over there. Maybe he is now after this one. He did run second to Bailly last time, but his form before that was a little bit spotty.
The Appleby dominance continued, or I should say began, in the Grade 1 Summer Stakes, just run a little bit earlier than the Woodbine Mile on Saturday in Canada. And the winner of this one, Mysterious Knight, similarly dominant to Modern Games, Craig, as he was bet down to heavy favoritism and did not disappoint his backers, just traveled like a winner every step of the way and ran clear to a pretty easy victory in the end.
I was as impressed by him as I was by the winner of the Woodbine Mile, Modern Games. I mean, it was completely dominant performance, and this one as opposed to Modern Games, who, like I said, looked like there was a chance he might get bottled up. This one just looked like he was winning every single step of the way. Even though he was in behind a little bit, he was always going to be able to find a path. You could just see it. And once William Buick set him down for the drive, it was over in the blink of an eye. I mean, he took the lead, and it was obvious nobody was catching him as he just ran away from the field. I mean, Chad Brown's a praise. He ran pretty decent, which we had seen from him his first 2 times out, but he's an okay horse, but he was no match for Mysterious Knight, who's getting a 108 speed figure for that win.
And that is a strong speed figure for a 2-year-old on the turf. Definitely makes him one of the major players for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf if they decide to go there in his next start. And kind of similar situation to Modern Games when that one came over as a 2-year-old, not considered to be nearly among the best in Europe, really more of a Grade 3, Group 2 type. But coming over to North America, as you said, these Europeans are just so dangerous and superior to their North American rivals, and there was just nobody in the same league as Mysterious Knight in this race. I thought Appraise ran fine to be second, obviously got the distance. Maybe that was a question for some others in this race. At the end of the day, I think it's fair to question what was really in this field behind Mysterious Knight, but when you get the kind of speed figure that he did, it does say the performance was legitimate. The 2-year-old fillies were on display in the Grade 1 Natalma, the female counterpart of the summer, run later in the card. This one, of course, being a prep for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf. And big upset in here, Craig, as the longest price on the board got the job done in Last Call, breaking her maiden in this spot. And as I was kind of talking about on the TimeformUS Forecast last week, what she really needed was a cleaner trip, and she got that here with the blinkers coming off.
Right. I don't want to talk too much about this one because this was your time to shine as you selected this horse as your top pick. Just very impressive. You laid out all the details why. She got a 98 speed figure. You'll note it was a pretty slow race compared to the summer stakes, but this one did get a pace upgrade as they were just crawling up front. And to me, that makes it even more impressive what Last Call was able to do, just blowing the field, not blowing them away, but she made a powerful move to go from 6th to 1st in a pretty short amount of time.
Yeah, and I think a horse like this just really shows the value in watching trips, how important that is, because she did look a little bit inferior on paper, but this was the kind of race where nobody had that standout speed figure. Even the horses that were taking a lot of money, they hadn't run that much faster than even the longest shots on the board, like Last Call in this Natalma. If you go back and watch her last race, like I was talking about on the forecast last week, she was just so rank in trouble from the start, just looked like a horse that hadn't delivered her best effort that day because of the trip that she had gotten. And they took the blinkers off for the first time in her third career start here. And you could see right from the gate, she was just so much more settled. And like you said, she did have to do some running to get up into the mix there because she was at the back of the pack early. But I liked the ride that she got from Rafael Hernandez, staying out in the clear, got the jump on some of her main rivals, so was able to strike the front with plenty of time, and she held off the late runners at the end. I do want to mention G. Lori, Craig. She's the one that I saw some people were saying maybe was a little bit unlucky in here. She was stymied in traffic in upper stretch, ultimately did get through. I don't know if she was going to win this race, but she would have made it closer at the end.
Yeah, I agree. She ran fine. She kind of, I'm still a little torn on her. We talked about her on the forecast. She had won so impressively at Colonial Downs, but with only an 80 speed figure that day. She obviously improved here, but I do wonder, part of that getting stymied, I think, was she just didn't quite have that quick turn of foot that some of the others did in here. And it was a slow pace, maybe get her up a little closer.
Now, unlike the summer stakes with Mysterious Night, I don't think that we're necessarily touting Last Call or any of the horses coming out of Natalma as necessarily the ones to beat in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf. A lot of preps still have to be run, and we've already seen some pretty impressive 2-year-old fillies at Saratoga, thinking of horses like Be Your Best and Shigera. So we'll see how that race comes up, but I think the fillies in this Natalma Stakes are going to have to get a little faster if they move on to the Breeders' Cup.
I agree. This was a much better betting race than it was a prep for the Breeders' Cup.
Well, let's talk about the last of the Charlie Appleby trio that came over to the United States, or I should say North America this past weekend, or I guess this one didn't really come over because Nation's Pride has been stabled in Saratoga and in New York for the past several months or so. He just stayed here the entire time through the Turf Triple Series. But Craig, this horse was winning his second out of 3 in that Turf Triple, nearly swept it, probably would have if he hadn't gotten that poor trip in the Belmont Derby, but just seems like Nation's Pride is doing better than ever now in September of his 3-year-old season, and the question for him really was to stretch out in distance, but turns out 1.5 miles might be even better for him given the way that he ran.
His most dominant performance in the series. Obviously, he had trouble in that first one and just missed when he ran second to Classic Causeway, but the last 2 he's looked good, and it just seems like the more distance, the better. He improved his speed figure yet again to a 123. Won by over 6 lengths. So this is a dangerous 3-year-old. I know I talk about it a lot. I don't generally consider 3-year-olds to have a big chance, especially at these longer distances against older horses. But after what we saw from Yabir last year and now Nation's Pride this year, he certainly looks like he could be a contender to me.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Yabir because I thought Nation's Pride was more impressive winning this Jockey Club Derby than Yabir was winning it last year. And I know Yabir looked great in that race, making that blitz at the top of the stretch to get there. But Nation's Pride was just so dominant against this field and extending the advantage over Classic Causeway after kind of being pretty competitive with that horse in both the Belmont and Saratoga Derbies. Stretching out to the 1.5 mile distance, there was just a chasm between them. And I do want to point out, Nation's Pride got an absolutely perfect trip and ride from Frankie Dettori in this race, just sitting in the pocket the entire way, tipping out at the top of the stretch once they straightened away for the drive. But the way that he kicked in the final 1/4 mile was really impressive. And like you said, the speed figure that he earned, a 123, that puts him in the conversation for a race like the Breeders' Cup Turf without a whole lot of improvement. So I think he's definitely an exciting runner if they decide to stay in the U.S. with him. Let's move on to the Jockey Club Oaks, the filly counterpart of the Jockey Club Derby. This one also closing out the Turf Triple Series for the fillies, and another runner that was able to win 2 out of 3 legs of the series as McCulloch got back to the winner's circle. She, of course, won the Belmont Oaks, went down to defeat to With the Moonlight in the Saratoga Oaks. That rival not in this race, making things a little bit easier for McCulloch to get the job done. But she still did have to kind of eke it out, Craig. I'm not sure that she really appreciated the stretch out in distance. She might have just been better than these horses.
Yeah, I agree. It was a really fast pace. I thought she got a perfect setup. Her only real competition was the shipper Toscana Bell, and that one really fought her to the wire. Now, McCulloch did kind of seem to veer out. I'm not sure exactly what happened there with her. when she made a right turn, but she was able to dig back in. But both of them were really game to the wire. McCulloch's getting a 116 speed figure. Toscana Belle actually a little bit higher, 117, because of how fast the fractions were early. Unlike the males, I don't really think these horses are going to be contenders for a race like the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf. They're just not quite as quick. So good, solid fillies who I'd expect to be better next year, but not really contenders for me for the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, ultimately this was kind of a thin race beyond the top two. Miss Yearwood ran fine to be third, but the fact that she was picking up ground on the winner at the very end of the race kind of says to me that McCulloch got there, and like you said, she was drifting out a little bit in upper stretch, seemed like she was getting leg weary. She made that blitz to the front end, showing that turn of foot at the quarter pole, but seemed to peter out a little bit after that. So I don't think that a mile and 3/8 was the best natural fit for her. She was just a little bit better than the runner-up Toscana Belle, or maybe not even. I think they actually ran pretty similar races because, like you said, Toscana Belle was setting that pretty honest pace. And Craig, we should mention the Jockey Club Derby and Jockey Club Oaks both resulted in track record performances for the mile and 3/8 and mile and a half distances at Aqueduct, but it kind of is a unique situation because we're not usually seeing horses run in September at Aqueduct. These are much firmer turf courses than what we typically see in either April or November when they usually run the Aqueduct meet.
Right, and I'd have to go back and see how often they even run these distances. Obviously, were they both run on the outer turf? I guess they were. So that one's or the inner turf.
The inner turf, they turf.
Were. So yeah, at least that course has been around a while, and I guess they've run the distance pretty reasonable amount of times. But you know me, I'm not going to put a whole lot of stock in track records. There's always something, and like you said, they normally just don't run on this firm of turf at Aqueduct.
Well, the other stakes that they ran in this past weekend in New York on Sunday was the Grade 3 Pebbles. This one for the 3-year-old fillies going a mile, and same exacta last time as the risk reverse up at Saratoga, Craig, but just different order, as a very different pace situation for Faith and Humanity allowed her to turn the tables on stablemate Gina Romantica.
Faith and Humanity's become a favorite of mine because she won that maiden debut at Monmouth Park. Got a big figure, one that was kind of, not really shaky to give. It was a solid figure, but you always got to look when a horse wins that easy. And she's jumped right in the stakes competition and done really well. And her and Gina Romantica, it seems like at this point it just comes down to trips. Who's the one that's going to get the better trip? Last time Faith and Humanity tracked a fast pace. They were all the fractions were coded in red. Wasn't quite able to hold up Gina Romantica, who looked like she was shot out of a cannon that day, finishing off the race. And then today, when the speed scratched, Faith and Humanity was alone on the front end. We have 2 of the 3 fractions coded in blue as being slow, and she had just enough left to hold off her stablemate. So these two are pretty good. 115 speed figure for Faith and Humanity, a 116 for Gina Romantica, and that compares pretty well to what we just talked about with McCulloch, obviously at a much shorter distance. But class-wise, these are pretty good 3-year-olds.
Yeah, I know we were talking about this race a little bit before we started recording. Different pace situation for Faith and Humanity, primarily due to the fact that there were some key scratches in this race. Originally, it was a 12-horse field. There looked like some horses that could go to the front end and potentially get in front of Faith and Humanity early. They came out of the race, and it just kind of left her as the lone speed, and I think that really complicated the trip for Gina Romantica, especially given the fact that she was drawn in the outside post position, whereas last time, I think you could have said that Faith and Humanity ran the best race despite finishing second, given the pace scenario. I think this time Gina Romantica was the one that really touted herself in defeat because she was never in a great position, never was on the rail this time, out in the 2 to 3 path the entire way, was still closing best of all into that slow pace, so I thought she ran really well to be second by a half length. Not that I'm taking anything away from Faith and Humanity, Craig. I mean, she's been running big speed figures right from the start of her career, as you said, and in just the 3rd career start to win a stakes, it says you have some ability, so it's going to be interesting to see if these two hook up again, who comes out on top and how the pace shakes out.
Yeah, and that's one of the nuances of our speed figures. In both cases where these two have hooked up, the horse that finished second actually got a faster speed figure. Obviously, they were both very close, and just one of those things. That's how we like to tell you how the pace affected the race.
Let's move on to Louisville, Kentucky. Churchill Downs began their fall meet this past week, and on Saturday they ran, I think, a quartet of stakes races. We're going to talk about a few of them. The only graded event was the Locust Grove. That one was won by, one of the three graded events was the Locust Grove. This was the only one for the older horses, won by Played Hard, 4-year-old filly, a horse who had shown some talent as a 3-year-old, but seems like she's really come back as an improved 4-year-old for trainer Phil Bauer, who has just been in the midst of an extended hot streak ever since the Saratoga meet, and she took a nice step forward to win this race convincingly.
Yeah, I guess you would have to say she's kind of the new player. She's really developed as a 4-year-old filly. She ran a career best on Saturday with a 118 Timeform US speed figure. Good effort for her. I thought it was kind of a weirdly run race, and that Crazy Beautiful somehow went to the front end, a horse who has never been on the front end early in the past. But it just seems like a couple of the others in here are maybe over the top, not quite what they were. Fillies like Envoutante, Gold Spirit just didn't show up, and Played Hard was able to dominate and just drawing away. I still think she would have to improve quite a bit to contend with horses like Malathot, who run in the 120s pretty regularly, but she just does have that good tactical speed to know she's going to get a good trip.
Yeah, it was kind of an odd ride on Played Hard by Joel Rosario, because heading into the first turn, kind of before that first call, she had broken on top and actually cleared off to the front end by about a length. And Joel took her in hand, and you could see Julien Leparoux was just kind of letting Crazy Beautiful roll alongside. Played Hard had crossed over in front of her, but once she got to the lead, Crazy Beautiful ranged up outside her, and Joel just seemed content to basically take Played Hard in hand and let Crazy Beautiful go on with it. Just some interesting chess moves in the opening 2 furlongs of this race, but ultimately Played Hard did work out that decent stalking trip and just clearly proved superior at the end as she drew off. Yeah, the other McPeak runner, Envoutante, Craig, it just seems like she doesn't really want to do it anymore. I know she's a horse that was initially retired at the start of the year. They had tried to breed her, it didn't take. They brought her back into training, and she just hasn't looked like the same horse ever since then, so maybe it'll be back to the breeding shed for her pretty soon. Let's move on to another stakes event run on that Saturday card at Churchill Downs for the older horses. This one, the male sprinters. It was the Louisville Thoroughbred Society. And miles ahead, a horse who had formerly done all of his good running at Gulfstream Park down in Florida, finally delivered a performance some other state other than Florida, as he is now in the barn of
Paul McGee.
He's been a private purchase, Paul McGee, since being formerly with trainer Eddie Pliza. And he delivered a nice performance here, Craig, though I think it's fair to say the runner-up might have run the best race in this one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He definitely ran a fast race. He's going to get the better speed figure. Isolate's getting a 121, while Miles Ahead's getting a 116. But I did like what I've seen from Miles Ahead. He's a horse who has done his best running his last 2 at Churchill. He actually came in off a 122 speed figure when he was narrowly beaten by the Breeders' Cup Sprint winner from last year, Aloha West. And Isolate, he definitely did. He fought all the way to the wire. This was a horse who, we don't have the fractions in red, but it was a good solid pace. The early pace figure 130. He was challenged before they got to the half mile. Quarter mile to go pole, and just really dug in, opened up, but you could just kind of tell Miles Ahead was going to wear him down. You had to figure that battle early was going to take its toll, and it did, but it was a close one. So good, strong race. This wasn't a graded race. By the speed figures, that's probably accurate, maybe a grade 3 type at best, but 2 game horses to the wire. It was a fun one to watch.
Yeah, like you said, these are not among the best sprinters out there right now, but Isolate did seem like he ran the best race, just engaged in that duel early, put away Top Gunner, who was dueling with him, and opened up that lead, just could not quite hold off Miles Ahead at the very end of the race, as the whole field was kind of coming together a little bit as they came onto the wire. So yeah, probably a listed, maybe grade 3 at best quality stakes race, but the runner-up did feel like he ran the best race in this one. Well, on Saturday, Craig, the horses that garnered the most headlines coming into this Churchill card were the 2-year-olds, particularly the two that were expected to battle it out in the Iroquois. And I guess they hooked up on the far turn. Damon's Mound and Echo again looked like they were going to put on a show briefly there, but when they got to the quarter pole, they just were completely out of gas, and the race fell apart, allowing the Tom Amoss-trained Curly Jack to get the victory in the Iroquois.
I felt like you when I was watching this race live. As they were midway on the turn, they looked like they were opening up a little bit, and I said, well, I guess it's the match race we all wanted. And it seemed like about a furlong later, it was pretty obvious they weren't going to hit the board as they just packed it in. Now, we do have all the fractions coded in red. It was obviously both of these horses' first time going long, but I don't think it can be a very good sign the way they packed it in. Maybe they're just sprinters. Both of them did very well at Saratoga. Obviously, Echo again was like the next horse of the world one of the Saturdays I was there at Saratoga, and he delivered, but just a big drop off here. And props to Curly Jack for picking up the pieces. He was a horse who had run really fast last time out at Ellis Park. I'm pretty sure we talked about that race on the TimeformUS Pacecast after it was run when he narrowly lost to Top Recruit. Got a 105 that day. He gets a 103 this day. And out of the new sire Good Magic, there was no reason he couldn't handle going long. He certainly looked like he was bred that way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what there is to it, but the top 4 finishers in this race were all coming out of races at Ellis Park. And the horses that were not coming out of Ellis were not nearly as successful. I mean, I don't know how that necessarily translates or if that's a handicapping angle to use, but Curly Jack, who had run that big speed figure and losing the stakes at his prior start, just seemed to really validate that performance here, stretching out to the mile and a 16th distance. The top 2, or I should say even the top 3, they got the trip, whereas those 2 favorites just seemed like they wanted no part of going this far. They did hook up a little bit early, I thought, on the far turn, maybe running a faster second and third quarter than would have been ideal, those 2 favorites, Echo again and Damon's Mound, but you didn't want to see them pack it in the way that they did. I mean, they were just completely empty in the final quarter mile of this race. And Curly Jack, I mean, he struck the front pretty early in upper stretch, but I like the way that he held on all the way to the wire. The runner-up, Honed, ran a very strange race. I mean, he was green heading into the clubhouse turn, veering out from the kickback. You could see he was in about the 7 or 8 path as they entered the clubhouse turn, coming out of the straightaway the first time. But he really leveled off and figured things out to get up for second here, greatly improving on the speed figure that he had run in his debut.
Yeah, he had only run a 63 last time, but I will say as we move on to the Pocahontas, one thing that I said after this race was, I have to remember Ken McPeek is always dangerous in these races.
Yeah, and Ken McPeek did send out the upset winner of the Pocahontas later on the card. Not quite as big an upset. This one paid $14 and change, but once again, a Steve Asmussen heavy favorite. Grand Love bet down to even money off her impressive debut score at Saratoga. Just a little bit disappointing. Not quite as much of a no-show as Echo again, because she was right in the mix battling it out to the wire. Just ended up fading to third as it seemed like some others wanted the distance a little bit more.
Yeah, I have to wonder after watching these races if, especially with the 2 favorites, Echo again and Grand Love, you just would have never seen this in the older days where horses have one sprint and immediately jumped out of their maiden win in the 2-turn graded stakes. And you just wonder if maybe it's a little too much too soon. It certainly looked like it on Saturday. Now, I'm not one to question Steve Asmussen, who's had tons of success, and the game has obviously changed, but when I watch these, I just can't help but wonder if they wouldn't have benefited from another race or even 2 before making that big jump. It just seems like an awful lot to me. Fun and Feisty was a horse who was making her 4th start, kind of gradually worked her way out, first time around 2 turns, and for Ken McPeek, like his horses so often do, was able to come from well back, and this wasn't a race that had the red fractions. It was just kind of a solid pace, nothing too crazy. And she was able to run by the field easily and was drawing away at the end. Now, she only got a 97 speed figure for this race, but she sure looked good to me.
Well, Craig, to your point, the top two finishers were both making the fourth starts of their careers in this Pocahontas, and that added experience seemed to allow them to get that added distance as they had kind of cycled up to going this far. Whereas the horses that you mentioned, those lightly raced runners, Echo Again and Grand Love, were making that drastic stretch out off one prior start. Grand Love, I believe, had debuted. I think they both debuted going the 6.5 furlongs at Saratoga. So not that easy to stretch out 2 furlongs in a stakes race after just one start, but that's kind of the way that these top barns just handle their 2-year-olds these days. Coming into the Breeders' Cup, a lot of the favorites have only run 2 times. You debut, you run into stakes going long, and then you run in the Breeders' Cup. I mean, that's just kind of the pattern that's been established these days. Long gone are the days when you would have a horse like Favorite Trick or More Than Ready who would begin their careers in April and run all the way through the Breeders' Cup. We just don't really see that anymore. So I think if the horses are not capable of handling that aggressive schedule, they're just not going to make a race like the Breeders' Cup these days. And you would imagine that it would be tough for Echo Again to get into a race like the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. The same for Grand Love, because this was supposed to be their prep, even though we have about, I think it's 6 or 7 weeks to the Breeders' Cup. It's not like these horses are going to run back.
No, for sure they're not. And just kind of a side note, I know as a morning line maker yourself, I want to nominate Grand Love's morning line as the worst of 2022. Uh, as we know, I tried my hand at morning lines a couple times. It's definitely a hard thing to do. But the first time I looked at these PPs, I was like, are you kidding me? This horse should be 7-5 tops on this line. It doesn't mean that she was going to win the race, obviously, but you just had to know she was going to get bet more than that 9-2.
I did not see that morning line until just now, but I think you summed it up, Craig, so I have nothing to add to that. Let's move on to a couple of the non-stakes events from last weekend at Churchill Downs, including a maiden race from earlier in that Saturday card. And I think it's fair to say, Craig, that the most impressive 2-year-old that we saw at Churchill on Saturday was the debut winner, Loggins, in the 5th race. This one making his debut for trainer Brad Cox, a horse with plenty of pedigree, being by Ghost Sapper. He certainly looked like one that will ultimately want to go longer, given the way that he drew off at the end.
Oh, no doubt about it. And we've talked about it often. Just because they're running these 2-year-old stakes races doesn't mean that you're seeing the best 2-year-olds. It's just a matter of timing and when they're ready. Loggins, obviously just a sprint, but ran a 108 Timeform US speed figure compared to the Iroquois, which was only a 103. Looked very good doing it. Certainly looked like a horse that wants to go longer. I'll leave that to you. I mean, he's out of Ghost Zapper and a Blame Mare, so I would assume more distance would be in the cards for him. They certainly have to give it a try, and I really liked what I saw from him. He just looked professional first time out.
Yeah, Loggins' Dam. She was a stakes winner going 2 turns, albeit on the turf. I believe she won the Grade 3 Regret at Churchill Downs when she was a 3-year-old. This horse, I think, is the first real meaningful foal that she's had, and certainly seems like a runner. This horse was no secret, bet down to 4-5, and Brad Cox has been unleashing some pretty good 2-year-olds as of late. He had some nice ones that debuted late in the Saratoga meet. People will think of that horse Verifying that won early on Travers Day, the younger half-brother to Midnight Bisou. Some runners that debuted that Hopeful and Spinaway weekend. He also had a horse that we're not going to talk about that made his debut in the first race at Aqueduct, I think on Friday or Saturday last week, that looked very good as well. So seems like Brad Cox has a pretty nice stable of 2-year-olds this year. We'll see if any of them are going to be ready for a race like the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. It's probably going to be a little bit aggressive to get Loggins into a race like that, but definitely for next year in the Triple Crown races, Brad Cox has some good ones. Let's move on to a race from Friday at Churchill Downs, and I think the biggest speed figure, Craig, that you assigned to any 2-year-old from Kentucky last week was this Allowance race on Friday, won by Frosted Departure, another Ken McPeak trainee that was coming in from Ellis Park, and he got the right kind of trip and pace setup, but boy, did he finish off this race impressively.
He did, and he wound up with, as you say, the best figure for a 2-year-old at 110 that we saw, and it was also his 4th career start, and he's yet another one that comes out of that top recruit Curly Jack race, so that is definitely already proven to be a key race. He's one who also looks like he could handle some more distance. He certainly got the seasoning. And it's one of these times of the year where Ken McPeak just looks hot, and I'm going to take everything he sends out pretty seriously until his horses aren't running anymore, because they're sure running right now.
Yeah, he does feel like one of those streaky barns that will get into these hot streaks that will last for a period of weeks or months, and it's definitely he's definitely firing right now, especially with those 2-year-olds. Let's talk about one more race from the past week, another one that could serve as a prep for a Breeders' Cup event. That was the Nownownow Stakes on Saturday at Monmouth Park. This one would, of course, be a prep for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf. Last year, it actually produced the wagering favorite for the Juvenile Turf in Dakota Gold, obviously, given the fact that Modern Games was running for purse money only at that spot. Not sure that's going to be the case with the winner this year, Web Slinger, though, Craig, he definitely was one that took a big step forward on the stretch out and distance. A horse that, if you follow me and my Horses to Watch show that I do on Daily Racing Form's YouTube channel, know that he's one that I was a little interested in because he had run a lot better than it looks in his prior start at Saratoga when he had a big trip. And I had kind of said that day, I want to see this horse go longer. Well, he got the chance here, though did so breaking his maiden in a $500,000 stakes race.
Yeah, that was crazy. Unfortunately, this is one of those races where I have to talk about the timing a little bit. Um, when I sent the worksheet to my partner, I didn't even give it a second look, as I usually don't till they come back. And then when I saw you had the race on the rundown for this show, I said, well, let me take a look at the worksheet and see if I can at least have a rough estimate for the figure. And when I looked at it, I was like, nope. And, usually I'll give something or tell you. And I said, I have no idea what it's going to be. The time doesn't make any sense. Well, when my partner sent it back, he kind of gave it a fast-paced breakout, which makes sense when you look at the fractions, but it still totally didn't fit with the other turf routes on the card. So I decided to time it, and just like last year's Now Stakes, this one was really badly mistimed. I got it about 1.43 seconds too fast. I think you're safe adding that time, give or take a couple hundredths, to all the fractions. I don't know what happened and why it happens, but the timer clearly started late for some reason. When you look at where timing started for this race and compare it to the other 1 mile races, it's visually very, very easy to see. So I knew there was an issue right away. So in the end, I wound up making the speed figure from the real times, the times that I got from video. Web Slinger's going to get a 101, which is solid enough, but it's certainly not what it would have been if you used the official time. It would have been much faster. And of course, it would have been wrong, just like the horse who won last year and wound up favored in the Breeders' Cup Juvie Turf.
Yeah, that's a very odd situation. 2 years in a row, the same stakes race. All the fractions posted as basically a second or more faster than they actually were. That's pretty unusual, but maybe there's some issue with timing the Now Stakes at Monmouth. Yeah, we should talk about the runner-up here, Craig Oxymore. He went off as the 2-5 favorite, was trying to stretch out for the first time. And like Craig was saying, don't pay attention to those posted fractions. He was not dueling through a 22 flat opening quarter, and when you go back and watch the replay, you can kind of see they were not aggressive at all in the front end. I mean, these horses were under strong holds right from the start, and I don't understand why a horse that's been on the lead in 2 consecutive sprint races comes out of the gate and Jose Ortiz decides that he's going to get him off the pace and with all of his intention to rate this horse first time going a mile. I just don't get that thinking.
No, I guess you have to assume it's trainer instruction. Is it? I have no idea. I see so many rides, especially on turf, that are just completely baffling to me anymore. I've given up almost trying to guess. It certainly didn't do this horse any favors, as it got beaten, wound up beating a race he probably should have won.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think Oxymore ran his race. He earned a comparable speed figure than what he's gotten in his turf sprints. It was just surprising not to see him as the clear speed in this race, given how much speed that he had shown in those 2 prior sprints. But yeah, Web Slinger, I was kind of kicking myself that I had missed this one live on Saturday, but he's definitely a horse that appreciated the added distance, and another example of why watching trips can be valuable. Well, Craig, that's all the racing to recap from this past week. Looking ahead to the TimeformUS forecast, I think it's going to make sense for us to take a look at that Pennsylvania Derby card at Parks on Saturday. I saw that they already did the draw for that race and the Cotillion. Looks like a strong field for both of them. Without sort of the leaders of the division, Epicenter and Nest, participating, they've come up as some pretty open races.
Yeah, I think that makes for better betting races. I was actually looking through our TimeformUS PPs last night to take a look at the card, and it's a good solid card as it always is at Parks for the Pennsylvania Derby.
So Craig and I will likely handicap that when we do our TimeformUS forecast later in the week. All of you, thanks for listening this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.